Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Hey everyone, you're listening to Prime by Cortex, a podcast where we discuss Creator Studio projects that are in the works or discuss the finer points of the various mechanics behind the system for the Cortex Prime role-playing game. We are not in any way affiliated with fandom, but, JT, we actually have some news with regards to fandom.
Yes, Fandom recently launched their own Twitch shows. They have Prime Time, which is sort of announcements and discussion. And then they also have Roll and Keep, which is their new Cortex Prime actual play series, where they'll be playing various games that were primed by Cortex.
And I think that was going to be weekly, but or maybe bi-weekly. But in any case, you can find that at their Twitch, which is going to be twitch.tv/fandom tabletop, I believe. We'll put it in the show notes. Again, they're not paying us to just put it out there. I just think if you want to see how Cortex is handled by the pros, you can just go over and watch them. In any case, for today's episode, JT and I are going to be talking values. So, JT, what are values?
So values are a particular trait set that basically focus on what the characters care about, and generally more of an abstract sense. So, they might care about power, or they might care about truth or justice. And I should probably mention that you don't necessarily need to care about it in a positive way. You could care about wealth because you want to be able to buy whatever you want and be selfish, or maybe you care about wealth because you're trying to donate all of it to all of the charities in the world or something like that and help bring people out of poverty. So there are no real, ironically, value judgments on why you care about those particular values. It's more just that those values are important to you in some way.
Right. And just like any other trait set, values are rated by die size too. And so this could be a little bit jarring, right, for people who aren't used to more traditional stats like attributes or skills. But like JT was saying, it doesn't really have to be like a positive thing for your character. Whatever the value set that you have is, there's no set lists, although there's a couple suggested sets within the Cortex Prime handbook. But basically, like a D4 just says you're not really into this, whereas like a D12 in a given value, like justice or glory, is like this is the heart, this is my heart and soul. But on that same note, like, you can have like a character who has like a D4 in truth and be a completely like honest person. In fact, they worry themselves over telling the truth, or they may worry themselves over telling the truth. But with that D4, they're more likely to have complications stemming from it, right? And you can be like a D12 person with the truth value and be an outrageous liar, right? So JT, I think you put it succinctly when it's just really more about the why.
Yeah, exactly. And you could always have trait statements there too, in case you wanted to specifically talk about how that value matters to your character, so you can clarify that way, so that people know the context of it.
Yeah, and trait statements is probably something that we can talk about now. It's not something that is necessarily attached to values specifically, although values is a very good trait to be hanging trait statements off of. So basically, what a trait statement is, and it could be attached to any trait set, is a phrase that kind of gives more coloring to whatever trait it's attached to. And so when it comes to value, if you have a value on the trait list that says truth, someone might write down the truth can be bent a little bit. This is the type of thing that can be challenged during gameplay and potentially rewritten, aren't normally set in stone. And so if you want to have that sort of dramatic head-to-head moment with other characters, whether it's a GMC or PC, then trait statements with values is the way to go.
Yeah, and since you brought up challenging your values, actually, Kirby, that can actually be one of the core ways that you can use growth in Cortex Prime, especially if values are an important part of your Cortex Prime game. One of the major ways that people are going to be able to change their character or like grow them is through challenging those and being able to like move the rating up on one value and down on another, things like that. Potentially, you could even tie it into if you're doing something with XP, for example, you might be able to tie challenging your values into XP, and then that would give them another incentive to do that.
Yeah, definitely. And the sort of games that you want to have values at can vary. Obviously, you can always have values within a game. I think values sit very comfortably as a prime set. And when you have values as a prime set, like good games to kind of have that for are sort of like your primetime dramas or political dramas, basically any sort of like dramatic show, right? So this is kind of like your CW shows like Arrow, even though you're playing with superheroes, those superheroes are probably using value sets. Sabrina as well, where Sabrina's constantly having her values challenged as she kind of juggles between her mortal side of her social circle and her not mortal side with regards to that social circle and that whole dilemma. And when you're using values as a prime set, it very often like replaces something that you might typically want to use like attributes. And when you're doing that, you're basically saying that the differences in physical or mental attributes don't really matter to what's happening, because in a game like that where you're using and leaning on values, it's not about necessarily the inherent ability of a person to get a thing done. It's about the drama behind it all. So, like, to give a very up to date reference, because it's 1997 and Buffy the Vampire Slayer is still on, right? It doesn't matter that Xander is just some average Joe trying to fight alongside with Buffy against vampires who are established as being physically stronger. What matters is that Xander's value of let's say his love die, because well, minor spoiler alerts for a really old show, he was crushing on Buffy, right, for a hot minute there. And so he might be rolling his d10 love die. He might be diving in to protect Buffy from getting flanked from a vampire that is sneaking up on her while she's contending with the big bad of the season, right?
Yeah, for me, I think the values really do sort of fit in. The first thing I think about is superhero games, just because, you always hear like they stand for, truth, justice, and the American way, or like things like that. So it's like very much focusing in on those values. And I think the key point would be if you're using values, then the question you're going to be asking is what things do my character care about? What are their motivations? What drive their actions? Is it, a sense of duty? Is it because they want the glory of being recognized as the world's greatest superhero? If anyone watches My Hero Academia, you can see a lot of this sort of stuff in play, actually, now that I think about it. So that's a very good example of something that would use values potentially. But yeah, I mean, basically, you're going to use values, as you were saying, Kirby, when it doesn't necessarily matter as much how you're doing something, but why you're doing something.
Yeah, definitely. And that's what I like to tell my players, depending on what values I've set out. It might not always be clear what values coming into play. And, I will happily talk through that with my player. But at the end of the day, I always tell my players that when it comes to values, I can't really answer that for my players because they have to answer it for themselves. Because it's like you said, it's about why they're doing a thing. Are they trying to help you out, JT, if you were a character in a CW drama, out of love, right? Because you're in some sort of dilemma. Or are they trying to still help you out, but maybe secrets is a value? And so they're rolling these secret value die because in helping you out, like, yeah, sure, you're this person's brother and blah blah blah, but also they want to make sure that should you survive, their secret doesn't get out in a hypothetical game where you just have some sort of plot point specific secret that they really care about.
Right, yeah. I think probably one of the points that we've sort of implied, but maybe not said outright, is that a lot of times if you're going to be incorporating values into your game, then you might not be as focused on the actions that are taking place. So like it's, you might not need skills with if you have a values game. Although sure, you could do some combination of values and skills. But like for example, you might be care more about like in a superhero game like why they're motivated to do what they do and like what powers they're using less than like oh are they like running or hacking or whatever. Like those things are just more narrative in like a comic book or a TV show. It's more focused on like the drama and the motivations of the characters and yeah sure they're using their laser eye beams to cut through the bus and escort people off and make sure that they get to safety. But it's more focused on the fact that they are doing it to save people and not as much like oh look at me, I can tear through buses with my eyes or whatever.
Yeah, and we see it all the time in comic books, right? Especially like a lot of the mainstream comics, but also the not so mainstream comics, where the arc might open up with Spider-Man swinging through a warehouse and beating up bad guys, but he that's just kind of all that fighting is just kind of set dressing, right? And so we can imagine as we get those like little internal monologue boxes that we often get with superhero comics and, well, frankly, comics in general, right? That while he's beating up these no-name bad guys, he might be thinking about a conversation he had with, say, MJ the other day. And so, you might be able to normally justify like rolling duty or power or something or a value like that in such a scene, but maybe your character's headspace is somewhere else. So they instead roll like say there's a value for like obligations, and so Spider-Man has an obligation to MJ to like attend one of her plays, right? And so he's just really trying to race through the scene in order to make it to her play on time, even though the obligation die might not be his best die. But that kind of brings us to our next point, which is a very common question: what keeps a player from just rolling their best value?
For my part, I would say that, of course, you're going to have sort of like narrative context coming into play. So if someone is saying, like, yeah, I'm going to steal a bunch of money and I'm going to use, my value of truth to do it, that's not going to make sense probably in the narrative context of the game unless they could somehow explain reasonably why truth is important in this moment to them. I personally can't even think of how truth would come into play. If I thought about it for a little bit, I could probably come up with something, but it probably wouldn't be that convincing compared to like if I was motivated by like greed or wealth or even power. So that there's a sort of the safeguard in that way. And of course, the game moderator is always welcome to say, well, okay, if you're going to use this value, then explain how it works in this situation or like where your headspace is like when you're doing it to justify the value. That's the first primary way I would say. What about you, Kirby? Do you have another one?
Yeah, so for me, so first and foremost, before we forget to mention it, mechanically speaking, if that's something that you feel like might be a problem, which is your player just rolling their D10 or D12 value die all the time and just always justifying that, is the Shaken and Stricken mod, which is basically a play off of the Stress mod, which we haven't talked about on the show yet. But essentially, you would apply stress to values. And so anytime they try to roll that value, that stress die gets rolled against them. And so it becomes more and more discouraging as that stress die goes up and up and up. for them to do so. But if you don't want to lean on mechanics in that way, doing it how JT suggested is a perfectly good way to do it. Another way I kind of look at it would be all these traits, whether they're abstract like values or something more hard coded like skills, should still impact the narrative, right? So to give like two examples, if we're in a high school drama, JT and I decide, and it's after PE and we're in the locker room and we're talking through our problems, and maybe JT, you're trying to walk me through a problem that I have. And maybe JT, like your value in this hypothetical high school drama is probably like, say, popularity. Maybe that's your highest value. And so you decide to roll that as you try to like help me, help comfort me, and help me go through my like recovery role for like complications or whatever I might be experiencing mechanically. Success or not, if I was a player, whether as a PC or a GMC for that situation, if you always roll popularity with that character, and that character has already like vocally expressed that, oh, all the cool kids are just bullies, etc., my character might have a problem with that. So you roll that popularity die, you roll failure. Well, maybe the resulting consequence is I get mad at you. Yeah, it's like, you're just saying that because you don't want to look dumb in front of the cool kids. Or say that you are successful, and you do manage to comfort me with with your value of popularity. That might change how my character acts going forward, for better or for worse. Maybe my character starts doing stuff that would lean more toward that popularity value to become more popular in school. And maybe that comes as some sort of consequence down the road.
Yeah, and don't forget actually that, like you were saying, people's actions and checks should have consequences, and they should be related to what they're doing. So if you're using a value, like you were giving the example with me using popularity, you can definitely expect that there will be sort of consequences involving your popularity, either positive or negative. And so, depending on how much you're willing to risk your popularity or have it be a problem for you, you may want to avoid, using it all the time, and, maybe try to mix it up a bit. On the flip side, you can also have certain things where, like, if you're leaning on something like popularity, well, maybe you're using your popularity sort of at the expense of a different value, and you may then think like, oh well, yeah, I'm being popular, but clearly I am devaluing, you know, my friendship by ignoring my friends to try to hang out with the popular kids. So maybe you then would maybe bump up your popularity and then bump down the friendship value, and that could sort of then mechanically, okay, well, sure, you're using your popularity a lot, but now this other thing is going to suffer, and it will have mechanical and narrative consequences for you.
Yeah, and the players and GMCs should also be keying in on the why another character is rolling. I mean, characters and GMCs don't magically necessarily understand that you're making this roll out of popularity or out of greed, right? But let's to kind of shift this in a different direction. Like, let's say JT and I are superheroes, and we're begrudgingly working together because maybe JT thinks my character takes things to the extreme too much. And so we may both have like a D10 in justice, but maybe JT's character doesn't like how and why I execute justice, because maybe my flavor of justice is perhaps too much of an anti-hero approach.
Yeah, I mean, the way that the Punisher approaches justice is way different than someone like Superman or Batman might approach justice, for example. They have their own
Yeah.
codes and their own way of dealing with things. So even just, even if they do have the same importance placed on justice, the consequences of that are going to be much different for between those characters.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you can see, when it comes to values, it can really drive up the drama even if that's not necessarily what you're going for. Which, you know, isn't to say that you can't bring values into something that's like more happy go lucky. In such a game, values might not be a prime set, it might just be a regular trait set that you have. Although I personally have a hard time imagining values in a game as a non prime set. I think it sits very comfortably as a prime set. Whereas with other traits, you know, I feel like I could take them or leave them as prime sets.
Yeah, that's fair. Also, if we were okay going outside of the book and outside of the box, Kirby, I was trying to think of other ways you could potentially regulate values in terms of preventing abuse if that's something that you're actually worried about. One thing is to incentivize, using different values. And one thing I can think of that I've seen in other systems is that there are some systems like Seventh Sea comes to mind, at least second edition. The first time you use a skill during a session, you get a bonus die to your skill. And I could imagine that if you want to do your own sort of homebrew mods or things like that, that sort of thing where you either get like an extra point of experience or an extra die or something for rolling a value the first time, that could be something that might incentivize people trying to diversify the values they're using a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll probably do, well, not probably, I think we will absolutely do another episode on just growing your character in the different ways you can do that. That said, like, whether it's Cortex or any game, if you want a player to do a specific thing, you incentivize them usually through like XP, or in the way that they advance their character, whether you're using the milestones in Cortex or whether you're just doing like these session callbacks. You might want to consider like what JT said. I think that's a very like smart idea to do actually. In which you just encourage your player to diversify how they're making their roles.
Let's not try to understate the importance of everyone in the group being on the same page, of course, because ultimately what it comes down to in any game is, you all need to be on the same page and know what your group considers to be fun and how your group is supposed to be having fun. And if someone is only trying to get the best mechanical benefit to them at the expense of like realistic role playing, there are a lot of players and GMs that are not going to be having fun with that sort of play. They're going to want to sometimes have their players not be in as good of a position for role playing purposes. And so basically, you just need to be aware sort of what your group likes or wants, and you need to sort of be willing to be flexible, as a player, and outside of being a character in a role playing game, you need to consider the out of character ramifications and your out of character relationships with the people around you too.
And I would say, personally, when it comes to like Cortex and games of its ilk, I don't sweat any sort of like imbalance from a player just spamming a thing. This question of like what keeps a player from just rolling their best value comes up fairly often. I feel like once a week as more and more people kind of trickle into the Discord. But at the end of the day, like it's really not a huge deal if you have a player that is power gaming. And frankly, when it comes to Cortex, even like the self-proclaimed power gamers that I've gamed with are typically honest about what they should be rolling, especially when you're putting it in their arena of like, you tell me what you're rolling.
Right. And if you are really concerned about that sort of behavior in the first place, it's not like values aren't the only prime set obviously that are going to be vulnerable to this. You could have a player who is sort of spamming their particular skill that they're good at. For example, if you have skills in there, or if you have particular roles, like if you have like the cleric, wizard, fighter sort of thing, and the player just tries to use their axe to hit everything, so they keep using their fighter role. I mean, that can happen too. Now, whether or not that is such a bad thing in the context is all dependent on how you think the game should be played. I mean, it makes perfect sense if a player is playing a fighter for them to be using a lot more of their fighter role than like a healer role, like a cleric or something like that.
And so that essentially is what values are in a nutshell. To kind of briefly recap, they are more about the why you're doing a thing than they are about like your inherent ability to do a thing. But with that said, this week JT and I do not have perfectly primed games for examples this time around. But JT, what's like a show or a book or two that you can think of where values would be like a very good addition to that game if someone were to prime it?
Well, I know, the last time when we did our distinctions episode, we talked about Avatar: The Last Airbender, and even you mentioned, I think, Kirby, how values can be important to characters, and I know that you ended up going more with relationships, right? Or am I getting it backwards?
No,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
was right. I went with
Yeah.
relationships. Yep.
So, but even so, I think that you also mentioned, and I agree with you that those characters are very motivated by values, particularly someone like Zuko, who's so motivated by his honor, and that's an example of he's trying to get his honor back, so he's actually considered dishonorable by people, and sometimes he can act dishonorable during the show, but he's just sort of obsessed with people perceiving him as being honorable. And so that's just a really cool example of how you could show how values don't always necessarily need to function in a positive way. But, you can have the antagonist, obsessing over a value and causing harm to other people because of it.
Yeah, definitely. I think a show that would do well with values, and this show actually already has its own role playing game. I believe it's the Age role playing system by Green Ronin, and that show is The Expanse, which is a sci fi show that follows several characters right throughout the solar system. And it's one, a political drama, which slots into the book's description of what values would be for, right? But then, two, like when you zoom in on the Rosinante or whatever they're calling it, the ship that James Holden and his crew are on specifically, you can easily imagine that as being a player crew. And, characters like James Holden are very much motivated by what they think is right and wrong and other such values. So a character like James Holden would probably have a very high, like, I don't know, ethics value, right? And
For sure.
and so that type of show, like the crew are constantly challenging each other on what they think they should be doing and why they should be doing it. And again, that why is what's important. Can you think of any other IPs maybe that would be appropriate for values?
We've sort of already mentioned this a few times, but almost any superhero property, whether it be Spider-Man or Justice League or what have you, can probably benefit from values just because it's just such a common trope for them to be motivated by these various virtues that they adhere to, or like they have these personal, moral codes and things like that that cause them to act in accordance with a particular value. So even though I feel almost like it's cheating. Pretty much anything superhero like Batman, Superman, um, even something like Fantastic Four, probably you could uh, put values into that. And I think what's interesting is you mentioned The Expanse, which is like one of my favorite sci-fi series of all time, book or TV show. Um, but I think that what I just realized when you were doing that is that pretty much anytime you have a cast where the focus is on like a crew, like a tight knit group, and you want to focus on the motivations behind their actions instead of maybe like their personal relationships with one another. You're focusing on, oh well, this one is greedy and focuses a lot on greed or power. This one is motivated by truth or justice, things like that. I think that those sorts of games are going to work really well.
Yeah, definitely. And honestly, like, we briefly talked about it before with growth mechanics, but and there's never like any one way to do a thing, but there's definitely kind of sort of preferable things to be doing and having things interact. And what I mean by this is whether you have something like the Expanse where, the crew aren't necessarily always on the same page. The growth mechanic, which is the growth pool, where you're rolling dice, and if you base that off of the stress that's being incurred from values or whatever have you, really feeds into this nicely. Because what happens is you're going to have players, once if they're new to Cortex, once it clicks for them, that when you say, all right, well, you've set the ship on the course to Earth, what do you do in the meantime, in all that downtime? They're going to want to take those opportunities to stress each other out in role playing scenes, be like, hey, so I noticed that you made a deal with that one person over at that one station. What's up with that? I thought that person was scum of the earth. And so what's going to happen is that they're going to get into contests with one another. Someone's going to lose out, but you know what? They're going to get a stress die from engaging in that role playing and engaging in those mechanics, which will then feed into their growth pool or challenge a trait statement if you're using trait statements, which is again always good for the growth pool. So it's very like adequate to have that kind of like interpersonal drama. But you gotta also make sure that your players are into it. Some players aren't necessarily into doing that kind of role playing or doing what's essentially like PvP.
Yeah, definitely. Kirby, I was thinking about it, and I thought maybe it would be a good idea for us to talk about some of the potential trait combinations that you could do with values and how those might work, or whether certain combinations may work naturally better than others when you combine them with values.
Right off the bat, we had Smallville, and I'm actually not sure if Smallville was the first one to be using like values as a trait, but you had Smallville, which is based off the show of the same name, and they had relationship dice, which is something we'll definitely talk about in a future episode, and that had trait statements. So I would say values would pair really nicely with relationships.
Yeah, I would also agree with that. Basically, if you wanted to have a game where everything was focused on the personal lives and the drama going on between the characters, then if you do values and relationships, you're going to get not only like, who's interacting with whom and who's doing what to what, but also why this person backstabs the other person, or, like why, this person goes and helps someone who, maybe they don't like very much, or there's going to be all sorts of things you can do. So like if you want like straight up drama, and like that's the main focus regardless of the setting or IP, if you just want like a very dramatic game, then that would be a really great combination, I think.
Speaking of like dramatic games, values fit nicely and is going to fit nicely in a lot of different genres. It may not be immediately clear. And, to give one last example, at least on my part, of an IP that could use values, I would actually say Mistborn from Brandon Sanderson and the Great Cosmere. Now, not to get into spoilers, obviously, but, Mistborn has a lot of like packed stuff with the world building, but at the same time, you have a lot of moments where characters are very worried over their values. And so, you have the main protagonist, who is a young woman, and she's, I mean, frankly, insecure about herself. And so she might have like a value that might literally just be self worth. And even though she at the beginning doesn't really have much self worth, she might have a very like high D10 value for that. Whereas someone like Sazed from the same series would have like a high value for knowledge. And you have other characters who care about doing things more the right way, whereas you have other characters who care about power. And so I would say that's an IP where it's not obviously like, oh, you should definitely use values for this. But, if you look hard enough in a well written piece of work, you're going to find that like all these characters care about different things, and these then become like sort of theme for their character arc.
We should probably say, because I feel like some of the stuff I've said may have been misleading, but having values in your game in no way limits the amount of action that can be in the game, or like the focus on the action. Because as we've said, there are plenty of superhero games where values are going to fit in perfectly, but there's still plenty of butt kicking and other stuff going on in superhero games. So it's not like having those values in there, but in any means prevents you from, doing all the cool action fighting scenes and stuff like that. It's just that instead of, you know, focusing as much on the particular actions, you're going to be focused on what's driving them. And probably the particular actions are going to be more narrative in the game instead of, mechanical things.
Yeah, definitely. It's like you just gotta frame the scene different, I would say. You have a duel between a Jedi and a Sith, and you often have like that moment where where there's a pause in battle, and the Jedi is trying to get the Sith to join the light side or whatever, right? And so you have a lot of action going on there. Now, I will say, like, when it comes to like action heavy games, there are players that will struggle with trying to figure out what value they should be rolling when rolling when rolling like in the middle of the gunfire stuff, and having good value trait lists would help with that, because if you have like a value trait list where like say survival is a thing that they value on that trait list, they're very often going to gravitate toward that because they're in a gunfight. Of course, they're going to care about survival. So maybe survival is not a trait necessarily that you might want to have in such an action heavy game, but that's something to consider, right? Is what is the intended like gameplay supposed to look like? Is action going to be heavy and super important, or is it going to be set dressing?
Yeah, and I mean, you could also provide other values to complement something like survival, of course, like friendship or peace or other things like that, where you can have different characters who might fight for different reasons. One person might be more focused on their own survival, but maybe someone is trying to fight the bandits that are attacking the town because they have someone in town that they really care about and want to protect them. So
Yeah.
and but I think it all comes down to what you were saying, Kirby, is that it all depends on what sort of game you want to run. And like we've said many times before in other episodes, there's no real right way to prime a Cortex setting. It all depends on what you want your game to be about. You could have a superhero game that's more focused on the interpersonal dramas, like Smallville, but then you can also have a superhero game that is more focused on sort of like the action and team ups and stuff, which would be more like a Marvel Heroic. And it's not like one game is necessarily better than the other. They just play differently and focus on different things. So I mean, one of the things I love a lot about Cortex and Cortex Prime in particular now is that you can tailor your game to the sort of experience you want to have. And like, hey, if you feel like doing a drama this week, you have the tools to do a more dramatic game. And if you want to do something a little bit more actiony another week, then you have the tools to bump up the action a bit more.
And I suppose, like, in terms of like what values are right for your game, like what that specific list looks like, an easy way to write that is to just think about what those type of characters, whether it's a band of scoundrels or a group of knights, or maybe you're just broadening the scope, and so it's not necessarily a group of X, but rather just people who live in this world. Just think about what those people in general care about. Think about, like, if they're playing a group of knights who are all like have already been vetted as the most like honorable people in the land, and you don't want to actually explore honor as a value, then don't use honor as a value, because you can just assume that they all care about honor in some extent, right? Or alternatively, use honor as a value, but perhaps use trait statements to like give different spins as to different people's view on honor. But in short, I think the easiest way is just figuring out what the people generally care about as it relates to the sort of action you're planning on having and the sort of group you're planning on having in your game.
Yeah, and what do you think about potentially taking opposing values and putting them in the same game?
Generally, like, I could see that for PCs versus GMCs, and I think we see that in Trace 2.0, which is one of the Cortex Prime settings. But Generally speaking, I don't think it's necessarily to have values that mirror each other, right? At least not in the same trait list. There's no need to have like a truth die on a character sheet, but on that same character sheet have a lie die because the die sizes and or trait statements are already going to paint that picture.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I just wanted to cover that because I know that there might be some people thinking about that. But yeah, usually when you have the values, you're going to want to be able to challenge them. And so there's inherently sort of this idea that you're going to act against that value anyway. So it could get a bit redundant. And like we were both saying, not saying that you can't do that, but that there are already mechanics in place sort of to help you explore challenging or going against type with your values. So it might not be necessary.
So I think that's all we have for today's show. Hopefully, JT and I gave you some valuable ideas.
Yes, we really value all of our listeners and the time they take to listen to our show.
We paid for the laugh track, right?
I think so. All right, we'll have to
Okay,
check. Yeah.
cool. Yeah. So yeah, if you want to check us out, where can they find us, JT?
Yeah, so one easy way is to email us at pbcpodcast@d20radio.com. We're also on Twitter at Primed by Cortex. We have our own Facebook group and page, so you can find that at Primed by Cortex on Facebook. And we also have our own channel on the D20 Radio Discord server. So check out d20radio.com to find a link to that if you want. And then also, as we've said in the past, we're on the official Cortex Discord server, which is not affiliated with us in any way, but we're fans like everyone else, and you can always find us there talking about Cortex. So feel free to drop us a line there too if you wanted. But yeah, I think that's about it.
Feel free to reach out to us. Let us know what you think. Would you like to see us prime one of those settings that we talked about today? Would you like to see us do a specific mechanic sooner than later? Let us know in your messages, and we will see you next time.
See ya, Cortex fans.